Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, May 2nd. Do you have any good news for us this Friday?
No.
Okay, all right. Well, let me jump into a couple of questions and comments that were posed by viewers first to get them out of the way. The first one to address is the F-18 that fell off of the aircraft carrier. A lot of people said that no, this isn't the case. It didn't fall from an evasive maneuver. Aircraft carriers don't make evasive maneuvers. They're massive, huge vehicles, huge ships. You can't just turn them around. Do you believe that's true? That instead it was maybe destroyed by Houthi drone or a missile and actually struck the aircraft carrier?
Um, no, I think the story is true. Yeah, I understand actually where they're coming from. I stopped and thought about it and said, yeah, those things are huge. It probably takes us a day to turn around or something. We often use the metaphor of a supertanker to say how difficult it is to change U.S. foreign policy, for example, which is to say it takes a long time. It's a very slow maneuver and very gradual. But apparently, these aircraft carriers are, in spite of being very large, rather maneuverable, and they do take evasive actions. I actually saw video footage of it wasn't the Truman, which was the aircraft carrier in this case, but I believe it was it the Eisenhower? I can't, actually right now the name escapes me. It was another U.S. aircraft carrier, and you can see it making a sharp turn and listing very obviously. So much so that yeah, you could see how an airplane that was not secured would actually fall into the sea. So it is believable. I understand the doubts, but I think it's clear that, in fact, that this is something aircraft carriers do, and it does explain the accident. I think also, it was the U.S. government official that gave the story, and we also saw some satellite footage that I think was provided by another party, possibly the Chinese, showing that it made a 180-degree turn there in the Red Sea. This is embarrassing in itself. Yeah, I don't really see that this is, if you're really going to cover it up, just pretend that something else happened. It was just an accident, somebody turned on the tractor and it went the wrong way or something, you make up a story like that. I think there's no doubt that it's a true story.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was skeptical as well, but I'll have to check out that video, see if it.
Yeah, it
See it
appeared
listed.
it was Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Oh,
One of the
okay.
recent episodes, he showed it. And again, if he's a military man, he's not a Navy man, but he has his connections, and he provided that footage.
Okay, interesting. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to address was from our conversation on Monday, where we were talking about the North Korean troops, and we had a viewer say that really the big story here isn't so much that there were Korean troops, North Korean troops in Kursk. It's that the Russians decided to tell the world about it. And why do you think Russia decided to come forward with this? They could have kept it silent. It probably would have just been buried. We would have been in just speculation. A lot of analysts,
Right.
including yourself, thought, yeah, the North Korean
Yeah.
troops weren't fighting there. So
Because
why do you
again,
think?
there wasn't any solid evidence to speak of. It really wasn't there. So I'm not embarrassed by saying, "Hey, I don't see any evidence. I don't believe this," because it just wasn't there. Um, the I think the main reason, or the most obvious reason that I can see, is really um, to thank to extend a favor to Kim Jong Un and his government, because it clearly meant something quite a bit to him. I think this was done at his request, at Kim Jong Un's request, and it was a very, very important, event in the North Korean military. It was something that mattered a lot to his own prestige, the prestige of his military, and so Putin went out of his way to acknowledge and to, speak of their actions in glowing terms, and I think it was a favor. I think a completely proper favor, or just kind of elementary. What do you say? an expression of friendship. What do you expect of an ally? And it's what he did.
Okay, so that's basically just to publicly thank Kim Jong-un and show that Russia and North Korea are really friends. And it's a big step for North Korea kind of being brought into the fold, so to speak, after being a hermit kingdom for so long.
Right. Yeah, but it certainly has an impact elsewhere, particularly in Northeastern Asia, because he's pretty much made it clear that, well, if the North Koreans find themselves in difficulty, under attack, we'll be there to help them out in the same way. And that, like I said earlier, that just has to change the calculus on part of the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Americans in the region. It changes everything. If they had some certain, contingency plans, they might be ripping those up right now. No, we're not going to do this. There was already the problem of nuclear weapons, but that just makes, I think, North Korea untouchable.
Okay, well, guess good for them.
Yeah.
Do you think that Putin coming out and acknowledging the presence of North Korean troops in Kursk, do you think this could potentially hurt his cause, or does really have no impact on it? My thinking is that it could be fuel for Western propaganda to say, like, look, the only reason that Ukraine is losing is because he had to rely on North Korea, and you can see Putin openly saying how thankful he is for all this help. If it wasn't for those pesky North Koreans, the Ukrainians would have marched straight onto Moscow.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people who are going to make that argument, but they're going to make that argument anyway, and they were making it already. I don't know if it really changes things significantly. Interestingly, there was can you find this? There's the narrative that's out there, but in the Western media, you do find occasionally some honest analysis that really sabotages the narrative and potentially could change it. And we had that recently with the Wall Street Journal article that spoke of a major buildup of Russian forces. So you can't really have both. There's a major buildup of Russian forces, and they were utterly dependent on the North Koreans. That's it doesn't. It's not logical, but they don't have to be logical. That's what we see, and because they were running with this North Korean story even when they didn't have the evidence. It doesn't. It changes my view of things because I didn't believe it, but they, a lot of those people did believe it. Turned out that they were right, I think, for the wrong reasons. They just simply believed what they were told, and they also believed an exaggerated version of it, and then their analysis is flawed. They think that it was because the Russians were weak. None of that works, but it doesn't matter to them. They're gonna just keep on running with it, and I don't think it really changes anything on the in terms of the narrative on the Western side.
I've been seeing lots of little clips of Trump where he seems to genuinely want to end this war in Ukraine, that he wants to extricate himself, and he says that he seems to have a good relation with Russia and Putin, and that this is Biden's war, and he just wants to see the killing stop, saying every week 5,000 young men are dying and this needs to end. But it seems like he can't end it. In my mind, it's odd. If you're the commander-in-chief and you were elected on this platform to say that I want to end these wars, and there's a risk of World War III. To me, I was thinking that he could just come in office and say, okay, show's over. And we're seeing that that's not happening. And what's most likely going to happen is that the war is going to continue to grind on, and he won't be able to extricate himself from this war. And that's just strange to me. I didn't see that coming. I know you said that you didn't think you'd be able to, but can you explain to me again, why is it so difficult for Trump to extricate himself from this war?
Yeah, well, I think there's really two things. First, he was up against a lot. He said that there's a deep state. It's very difficult to change foreign policy. We have the blob, that's just kind of the military security state that's just there regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. And he was up against that. I think any president would find it a huge challenge to affect a significant change of direction in U.S. foreign policy. So there's that. But then the other part is that Trump himself, as you said, he's a very flawed vehicle, a very, let's say, flawed leader is what I really should be saying. I think often, not always, but often he has the right instincts. I think you're right that he really does want to end the war, that he's actually bothered by the loss of life, and that makes him exceptional among Western leaders. But he doesn't know how to go about it. He has an imperfect grasp of the facts, and he just, there are those you can go through and find all those statements where he seems to be, completely aware of the reality, and but then you can find others where he's kind of repeating what he's heard on Fox News or what his envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, has been telling him, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And you're not going to affect a change if you're going to be inconsistent in that way. If you're going to keep on changing your tune, and you have to understand what's going on and then just go at it really, in a real systematic, disciplined way. And unfortunately, I just don't think Trump's capable of that. He's just not that kind of person. He always shoots from the hip. He's a loose cannon. And that sometimes can make real change. It's sort of more in a destructive sense. But in building up something like establishing a new treaty, it's harder. One thing he could have done, again, it was always going to be a monumental task to actually reach some sort of or conclude a peace treaty. That was going to be very, very hard, and I think well nigh impossible for any leader. But he could have, and he still could, but now it's harder. Just say, okay, I'm not having anything to do with this. We're cutting off supplies. Our role in this has ended. This was stupid. It wasn't my war. Unfortunately, because of recent developments, that looks less and less likely. But he could have done that at the beginning. Now, that would have been hard. Again, he would have been up against the deep state. He would have been up against the media establishment. There would be howls and constant pressure, both within his administration and of course from the Democrats and from enemies, establishment enemies everywhere. It would have been hard, but he could have done that. And that's something, because that is within his power. It really is. To cut this off. And he is, especially at the beginning, a popular leader of the Republican Party. He had control over the purse there. Now, I have my doubts that I'm very doubtful that he's going to do that. I'm afraid that we're going to just kind of go back, that the war will remain as it has, and that we'll just continue to support Ukraine.
It doesn't make sense to me, though. You say that he genuinely wants to end this war, and he's sending Steve Witkoff over to talk to Putin. They seem to have a good relationship, and they spent hours speaking with each other. So they got to understand, to some extent, the Russian point of view. So at the same time, they're being sympathetic with Russia. It's like, okay, we understand. We need to get a peace deal. But on the other hand, they're still sending in military equipment into Russia that is being used to attack Russian soldiers, Russian troops.
Well, not into Russia. You mean into Ukraine.
But Russia would say otherwise, right? Right.
Yeah, but I think, one thing that is important, and hopefully that has changed, and for this we need to be grateful to Trump, acknowledge, a significant change that he did effect from day one. We haven't seen any more of these attacks or storm shadow attacks into pre-2014 Russian territory. That has stopped. And that's very important because that was, as we said, that made the U.S., it's clear that, the U.S. was and continues to be deeply involved in this war, but they weren't directly attacking pre-2014 territory. And with the ATACMS missiles, they were. Because it wasn't just that they supplied the missiles to Ukraine. Understand that they actually have to be very much involved in operating those missiles and launching them, choosing the targets. So they were attacking Russia. This was very, very dangerous. And that apparently has ended. Let's hope it stays that way. But otherwise, things have pretty much remained the same.
So you think that the U.S. will continue to give military aid, intelligence to Ukraine up to the point where there's an utter military defeat? That we are just going to stay in here, even though Trump is saying we got
Yeah,
to end this, we have to have a
right,
peace deal, but at the same
right,
time, the money keeps on flowing, the weapons keep on flowing.
right,
What's
right.
going
I
on?
agree.
You don't want to end it if you're doing that, right? That
Right.
to me, that's
Well, no,
clear.
I think he wants to end it. Again, he just doesn't know how. And he does have people arguing, I'm sure, that, giving him the same old Biden kind of argument. The establishment Republicans around him are telling him this, that to get the Russians to the peace table, you need to pressure them. You need to impose new sanctions. You need to, supply more military equipment, to apply more military pressure on them. And then, they feel the pressure, they'll, they'll come to the table. It's a peace through strength kind of argument, right? Um, so, I'm afraid, again, he had a very kind of naive view. I thought that he was going to have the ceasefire and he was going to get him to agree in just a short period of time. And it showed a lack of understanding. So he is vulnerable, it's just that because he doesn't fully understand. And he does have some understanding, again, because he does hear, there are people around him who are telling him what's really going on and what the Russians really think. Unfortunately, it's just like he's hearing that in one ear, but in the other ear, he's hearing the same old thing. And now he's frustrated. He had his plan to reach some kind of peace deal, a ceasefire that was going to become permanent. And that's just not working out. And then the other people say, well, we have a solution. You can do this. You can just kind of put the screws on the Russians and then, cause some pain and then they'll come to the table. And it's ridiculous. He should know that that's not true. That's what Biden did, and it failed utterly. But I just don't have a whole lot of confidence in Trump. He may fall victim to that kind of argument. And now I think it's important to point out that we have this so-called minerals deal, and that what I'm afraid, again, it was signed, or at least part of the agreement was signed. I think there's supposed to be 3 documents, and the main document was signed just the other day between Ukraine and the U.S. And it gives we can go into it more detail later. It's actually still unclear exactly what it consists of, what what's going to do at a very concrete level. But the idea is that the U.S. and Ukraine will have some sort of joint investment fund, and it's going to be forever. And there's also the suggestion in there that the Ukrainians or the Americans, no, I guess the U.S. can make payment in the form of weapons. And so anyway, it just seems to, well, the fact is that if this agreement appears anyway, because again, we don't know all the details, appears to give the U.S. a powerful incentive to stay there and even to expand, Ukrainian territory at the expense of Russian control. Because as things stand, the Russians control about 40% of the natural resources. It's not just minerals, but at least 40% of the natural resources that would be covered by this deal. And that number is increasing. With every Russian advance, they get more of that territory, more of those natural resources. So it gives the U.S. and Donald Trump in particular an incentive to really support the Ukrainians and to push back the Russians. And what I'm afraid is that, okay, Trump, again, I think he really did he really wanted peace. I think that's true. But he also just really wanted a deal, something that he can say, look what I did. And then, bring it back. It's just say, like, this remarkable achievement of mine. And I think maybe the Ukrainians have given him that. And he may just latch onto that and make that, and declare that that's his solution to the problem, or that's his great achievement, and then actually renew his commitment to Ukraine, because all the incentives, if in fact he's really serious about this deal, all the incentives are on that side.
Right. This deal doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So the idea was that the U.S. would begin to go in and develop mining facilities, whatever it is, rare earth refinement in Ukraine. I mean, this is
Yeah.
would be a lot of capital, take a lot of time, I imagine. I mean, these things don't just you don't just get a shovel and dig them out of the
Oh, yeah.
ground.
Right.
Otherwise, they would have been done already. Clearly,
Right.
this is not something that's easy to do.
Yeah.
So the idea it could take a decade or something to build
Yeah,
stuff like this.
It
Right?
clearly could. Right. Yeah. It's going to take time. And right now it's impossible. Ukraine's at war. I mean,
Right.
it can't be done. So it's kind of pie in the sky sort of stuff. That's true. And then if you freeze you can say, well, this gives an incentive for him to push for a ceasefire because only under ceasefire conditions would this plan really be implemented. But on the other hand, it also gives them an incentive to try to push back the Russians, it's been proven to be just impossible. Again, real attempts, enormous efforts were made in that direction, and they failed miserably. Again, the summer 2023 offensive is the best example of that. But it does give the U.S. an incentive to push back the Russians because the Russians have almost half of those natural resources that would be covered by the deal anyway. So anyway, that's where we are.
Right. I heard that Donbass actually has the most wealth. That either the Russians, maybe it's half of the resources approximately, but I think it's the more valuable resources. I heard something about.
Yeah.
That.
No, I think that's clear. And so I mean, I've heard the 40% figure, but earlier I've heard 50 or better percent. It's a huge, Donbass has the greatest mineral wealth. There's no question about it. That's one reason why Donbass has been difficult for the Russians to take because there are a lot of mines there. Often, many of these battles were fought around mines or on these huge slag heaps, that are again kind of a byproduct of mining and of smelting and all these other industrial processes. So the Russians have already taken most of the Donbass and they're poised to take the rest of it. It's expected that they'll probably take the rest of at the current rate, they'll probably take all of the Donbass by the end of this year or early next year. And of course, it could go faster if we see a collapse.
So is this a done deal? You said there are 3 documents. The main one was signed. I mean, is this actually happening?
Yeah. There was supposed to be. There were these rumors that the Ukrainians were refusing to sign 2 of the documents, and the Americans said, "You better sign all 3 of them, right now, together at the same time, or you're not getting this agreement." And then what we've heard is that one document was signed, and that has been published in Ukraine. Again, it's lacking in detail. It's not a full contract. When you're talking about, an investment contract, it needs to be very detailed. The devil's always in the details. You have to, it's explained, it's said that they're supposed to be joint control. What does that really mean? How do you ensure that? How is that even possible? If you have 50% and 50%, well, how are decisions going to be made when there's a disagreement? All those things have to be worked out, and they're not worked out in the agreement that was shown. Well, okay, so the one document was published, but then the other 2 that were supposed to be signed haven't been. Maybe they have been signed, but they haven't been published yet. And we don't really know exactly what they're about. It seems all in all, I mean, this agreement appears to have dropped let's say the most outrageous demand on the part of Trump, which was that, okay, you need to pay us back for the $350 billion that he says we gave to them. Now, he seems to be the only one that claims there's 350. I don't know how he came to that. Maybe it's true, but nobody's really explained how that number was arrived at. That's been dropped. But so now we're talking about actually future deliveries. Like if we send you more weapons, then that has to be regarded as payment, or may be regarded as payment. That's, again, I saw that language, may. So what does that mean? Is if the Ukrainians agree to, or is it just if the U.S. agrees to it? That's a huge difference. We need to find out about this. But all in all, it seems like it's not nearly as outrageous a kind of agreement that the Americans were pushing earlier, which was just would have been gone down in history as one of the most, rapacious and unfair treaties ever foisted upon a country. Now it's, I think in the end, it's not what Ukraine wants. If they had freedom, any country wants to have economic sovereignty and make agreements with different countries, for different kinds of natural resources, because you want to look around and see who gives you the best deal, right? And you want to have, you just want to have autonomy, but this agreement takes that autonomy, that sovereignty away. And it's a forever agreement. It's just that all natural resources are going to be at least under the partial control of the U.S. forever in Ukraine. And that's obviously a real surrender of sovereignty by Ukraine to the U.S. Now, they may be just bargaining, and I think probably with some good reason, that this will never be implemented. Well, first of all, the war has to end, but even when the war does end someday, Trump will be out of office probably, and maybe the next administration will tear it up.
Do you think that Russia would be okay with this? Like, will this affect Russia's calculus if the idea is that, okay, they have this mineral deal and they can extract the minerals and pay the Ukrainians in weapons? That's clearly not okay. This makes Ukraine essentially a vassal state of the U.S. It becomes our little, pet that we have to protect. That's right on the border of Russia.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what actually the U.S. administration officials are saying. There's no explicit security agreement in this treaty that we know of. That was something the Ukrainians were asking for, but it was not included within the treaty. Again, as far as we know, according to the document that's been published. What the U.S. is saying is that there's an implicit security agreement, because now, we have this incentive to help them out. And if there ever is a ceasefire, we'll have our guys on the ground, and the Russians will never want to, our engineers and let's say, oil executives or whatever, they're going to be on the ground, and the Russians will be careful about firing missiles into Ukraine because they don't want to kill any of our people. This is what the U.S. administration is saying. I'm sure that the Russians are looking at this and saying, this is a bad sign. It looks like, this whole thing's falling apart. I think the Russians were always very realistic. If you listen to what they were saying, they encouraged, they said, let's talk, let's do what we can. But they kept on saying, hey, we got a long ways to go. And then you were getting these absurdly optimistic statements from the U.S. side. It's just like, there's a deal just right around the corner. And we've been hearing that for weeks now. And it was always silly. And the Russians were saying, no, this is hard. This takes time. And, let's just do what we can. They were hoping that at least they'd get the embassies restaffed and get a normalization of relations. And, it's not clear that any progress really has been made in that one area where progress clearly could be made. It's not like you have to twist the arms of the Ukrainians and the Russians to do that. It's just like if the U.S. wants to do it, they could. But we haven't seen any progress yet. And maybe it will be. It's good that they've had talks, but, let's see some results.
It's worrying.
Yeah.
For these natural resources that are in Ukraine that we want to extract, doesn't the U.S. have these natural resources here? We're a huge country, a lot of land.
Yeah.
Because we're talking also about, revitalizing the U.S. economy. Would it make sense to build the mining infrastructures here and employ Americans? I mean, isn't that part of America first and make America great again for Trump? Why does he want to go and do this deal here in Ukraine that's going to get us tied to Ukraine, that's at war with the largest nuclear superpower in the world, where we have to go and invest in here, and neither party likes us. The Ukrainians don't like us. The Russians don't like us. Yeah. Just get out of there, man. And then who knows if we're going to be able to get these resources anyways. You invest in this country, employ the Ukrainians there. Why don't they just build it here in the United States?
Yeah.
Or is there something that only Ukraine has?
Right. Yeah, there really isn't a huge need for anything that Ukraine has. There's nothing that Ukraine has, to my knowledge, that we don't have. We do have rare earth minerals. We haven't really developed the capacity to extract them. That takes a lot of time and a lot of money. The Chinese have, and that's why they provide a very large proportion of rare earth minerals to the world market. Actually, they're now denying them to the U.S. because of this trade war. So that's a problem. It's not a matter of need. It's just, you could say it's greed. It's to say that, well, probably whatever is extracted from Ukraine, whether it's natural gas or rare earth minerals, it would probably be sold to Europe, and you can make some money off of that. Europe is natural resource poor, and so Ukraine, within the European continent, is relatively rich, but by world standards, it's nothing exceptional. So that's what you could see. Yeah, maybe they can make some money off of this. Again, this is before you really see some returns on your investment. It would have to be years in the future, and have to be following a real, a long-term ceasefire. So I think it's really about putting a feather in Trump's cap. He really wants to say that he did something. He has some sort of achievement to show. He says that, yeah, look, I solved this problem. Okay, they're still fighting. I tried to knock their heads together and they just wouldn't listen, which of course is silly because you're on the Ukrainian side, actively involved in attacking the Russians. I just get sick of this pretense that the U.S. is somehow a neutral third party. It's just really silly. They're not. But that's the way he talks. So I say, but we have worked out this great deal, so at least we're not going to be paying for this anymore. They're going to be paying us for, the arms that we send them. Now, that's not really even possible because Ukraine is broke. So it's probably going to be, we're going to lend them money and then they're going to buy the arms from us and they'll never be able to pay back the loan. Something like that's going to happen.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a feather in his cap. I guess maybe to a superficial observer, they'll just be like, oh, great, we got this deal. Now we own Ukraine resources. It's like a third grade monopoly mentality.
Yeah. But there are a lot of superficial observers, let's be honest. It's not going to convince, it'll be a minority of supporters, maybe a majority of his supporters, but a minority of the population that's going to believe this was something real.
Right. Yeah, I just feel like if he decided to invest in building a huge refinery or a mining facility in the United States, that would be quite popular. I think there's a desire for that here in the U.S. Like, okay, good, the engines are churning again in the United States. You visually see that. Mm-hmm. I don't see why, but instead, he thinks the better plan is to build one in a war-torn country that's actively engaged in a war with the largest military superpower or nuclear superpower in the world. It just seems insane to me.
Right. Well, he's been fixated on this idea that, we need to profit from these conflicts or, these areas of the world where the U.S. is heavily involved, and that we've been kind of suckers, we've been taken to the cleaners by different countries. And he looks at Ukraine as saying, they took $350 billion of ours. And again, I don't know where he got that figure, but so it's something that clearly matters to him. If you remember, it was about a year ago, there was that bill, that $61 billion bill of support for Ukraine was held up by the Republican Congress with Trump support. And I think he had maybe one change that he made more of it into loans, and then he bragged about that. But again, these are loans that they're never going to pay back. And then he ended up supporting it. So I think that should be a warning. He opposed further aid to Ukraine, but then he supported it. And, right now it sounds like he's opposing further aid to Ukraine, but I think he probably will end up supporting it. Because, he does want a deal, but the other thing, let's not forget, he would rather have a ceasefire. I think it's true. But he also is terrified of the idea of a kind of an Afghanistan-like ending to this conflict, with the Russians just marching on his watch, just marching across to Kiev or to Odessa or something like that. And I really don't think he wants that to happen. If it becomes clear that may really happen, he'll just pull out all stops, or he to stop him. That's my fear. Maybe he'll show a certain amount of sense and just realize, okay, well, we lost this one. But I don't think he would have. He wants to see it now. If he had just washed his hands of it at the beginning, and tried to agree to the Russian terms, he could have said that I think it would have been torpedoed by the Ukrainians and by the Europeans. But he would say, okay, look, we agreed to this. They would have stopped right here, at these 4 oblasts if you had listened to me. Now they're marching there. That's your problem. You didn't listen to me. And he could really make that argument. Now that he's sort of involved himself in it again, and says, he's reached this great deal, so he has this incentive. When they're marching, they're not just taking Kiev, but they're also taking that territory that is supposed to make America rich. And it puts him in a real bind.
So do you think this mineral deal is a serious blow to any type of negotiated peace settlement now?
Yeah, I think it is. Again, it changes the incentive somewhat. And then it also just gives Trump an excuse to say, okay, yeah, I reached a deal. It wasn't the original deal, but I'm so clever, I worked on this over here, and that kind of led to this deal here. And so here I am, the deal maker, another success.
Right. And in order to protect the deal, he's got to arm Ukraine more and get more involved in the war.
Right. That's my fear. Now, it's just never completely safe to say what Trump's going to do, but that appears to be where things are headed now, unfortunately.
I mean, couldn't he, in his talks with Putin, and I think Russia would be open to having joint venture projects. I think they even said this, that right. Look, just because we have this territory, and look at Russia, we have the most territory in the world. There's a lot of resources here that we can joint ventures develop together and both profit from. And that can include whatever territory that they take from Ukraine. So that it's not necessarily a loss for Trump. I mean, you can make that. Yeah. That's the big deal that you want to make, is a deal with Russia.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Russia has the most natural resources of any country in the world, by far. The second most is the U.S. So like you're saying, it actually makes more sense if you invest in American natural resources. And Ukraine is it's, I don't know, what, number 10 or something like it. It's something, but it's very insignificant compared to both the U.S. and Russia. Now, with this territory that the Russians have taken in Ukraine, actually, if you add that territory to the Russian total, Russia becomes, its lead, it increases so that it has twice as much in the way of resources than the U.S. does, which is a distant second. So there are many more and better opportunities within Russia. If you're talking about business deals, it would make sense to go to Russia. And there clearly was some talk about that, and I think some genuine interest, but it's looking like that's not going to happen. Maybe, we'll see a change of course, but I think It's very doubtful now.
I would say that's the only way out of this potential current mineral deal trap, is to say, okay, well, let's make this even better deal.
It's kind of hard now that you've staked your prestige on this, and then.
Yeah, well, it seems like Trump he doesn't mind changing his mind.
No.
So it's amazing. I don't know if I respect. I guess I marvel at the confidence of Trump, that he can just get up and just say things.
Right.
Like this $350 billion. He says it again and again.
Yeah.
Nobody knows where this number comes from, but he's completely comfortable just saying it. And it seems like any type of big speech he's given to the whole world with huge implications, it's like he didn't even think about it until the moment he opened his mouth. Then he just started to say, it's like, wow.
Right.
It's
he
got confidence of
he does, and I think that explains why he's gone so far, and it really impresses people. I think that this guy's a leader, this guy knows what he's doing, and and then when it seems like when you point out, hey, you said this just 2 weeks ago, now you're saying the opposite, he just he doesn't care, and he makes a joke of it or just disregards you and marches through. He's still just as confident, he doesn't bother to explain it. Right.
I'll see just like one mean comment, I'm like, oh man, I feel I should have said that, and he's just he keeps on going, Okay, well, talking about more just Trump disappointments, something that he said during the campaign was that he was not a fan of sanctions. Sanctions, they don't work. They just make enemies of people. But now I just saw the news that he's putting incredibly strict sanctions on Iran, placing secondary sanctions on Iran. People that are doing business with Iran now will be sanctioned. Can you tell me about this? What happened here, if you're aware of it, and
Right.
the
Well, there were
implications?
already secondary sanctions on Iran, but I guess he's extended them, expanded them. New sanctions were imposed on Iran, in the midst of these negotiations. Hardly a goodwill gesture if you're really looking for a negotiated settlement. But the negotiations are going ahead. They had, I guess it was just this last Sunday, there was another meeting in Oman. And we didn't hear as much about this, but the Russians said, the Iranians said that they were tough, but they were really getting into the details. And the Americans described them as positive and constructive. So overall, it's encouraging, and I think that they're planning on having they were going to have a meeting on Saturday, but it was postponed. Now the Iranians are saying that's not because the negotiations have broken off, but it's sort of technical, logistical reasons. It's just been postponed. I don't know if a date has been set for the fourth meeting. It would be. There's the sanctions, but he also had some very fiery comments by Trump about Iran, and then I can't remember but new threats, and then Pete Hegseth, who we can get into, he made some sort of threats against Iran again in relation to the Houthis and their support for the Houthis. But Pete Hegseth, of course, is gone, or he's not gone, but he's no longer the Secretary of Defense. And
what? I didn't even see.
Oh yeah, no, he's gonna. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's not.
You're thinking of Mike Waltz.
Yeah. I'm sorry. It's not. Okay, yeah, I confused the two. It's Mike Waltz. Yeah,
right.
Pete Hegseth is still there, but Mike Waltz is gone because of the,
signal disaster fiasco.
Right, the signal scandals. There's more than one, but he will now be the permanent representative, U.S. representative to the UN. Yeah. Forgive me, mea culpa. But this is actually a positive sign because Mike Waltz was a real Iran war hawk, and he was one of the, clearly one of the ones who was really agitating for war against Iran, and was probably doing what he could to sabotage the negotiations. So the fact that he is out is good. We'll have to see who his replacement is. If it's another Iran war hawk, then okay, we didn't really make any progress. It was just about that signal scandal. But there's again, maybe they're just rumors, but it does appear that Trump really does want to deal with Iran, and it is doable. Whereas I think it's much easier, to make a nuclear deal with Iran than it would have been to to reach a real peace agreement with Russia. It's just they both have incentives to reach this deal, and they have done it before. They can do it again. It's just that we just hope that Trump has the patience and the discipline to stick with it. So far, in spite of the sanctions and some of his fiery comments, it looks like the negotiations really are going ahead. And there's reason to be cautiously hopeful there.
Okay. Well, I mean, like you said, these negotiations are going on, but then we put on these very harsh sanctions in the middle of the negotiations.
Right.
I don't understand the U.S. method. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And Russia, we're like, let's try to negotiate a deal. Here, Ukraine, keep on taking more money and weapons. Right. And then this in Iran, I mean.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, I think it's both, the divisions within the administration. You have a lot of Iran war hawks appointed by Trump. And you do have some realists who, again, do actually want to have a deal with Iran. But as was true in past administrations, there are divisions. So there are going to be different departments that are kind of pursuing different policies vis-a-vis these negotiations. And it may be that the Treasury Secretary Basant, he's part of that group that just doesn't want to see these negotiations go ahead. So he just went ahead with these sanctions. Now it shows a lack of consistency and leadership on the part of Trump if he's letting this happen. He should be running a tight ship and have a unified message on this, a unified policy. But he himself may be conflicted, as we know, or he's just not competent. He's not paying attention to what's going on, underneath him.
What do you think the U.S. is going to do in Yemen now? I mean, with this embarrassment of the F-18 falling off, it's just looking bad. I imagine Pete Hegseth and Trump have to be getting a little, I don't know, just frustrated, I guess is the term I would use. Do you think that we'll see things escalate there? And could that be the pathway to war with Iran? Because they don't want to admit that we're losing just to the Houthis. They say, well, it's only because the Iranians are the ones that are really behind this.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the danger, and that is. We did that I think it was from Pete Hegseth. Again, pointing to Iran, and of course, it's not just him, but many administration officials and Trump himself. So there is always that danger. There's no question about it. It potentially could torpedo in one way or another the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran.
Right. I feel like this negotiation, it's just like one tiny little flickering flame of hope, but there are all these forces outside that are just trying to extinguish that and start this war. And I don't know.
It still might happen. I mean, it's doable. It can be done because, well, first of all, the Iranians don't need to. I don't think they really want to have a nuclear bomb. They have this nuclear program. I think many people have argued over the years as a bargaining chip. They understand that just having this capability, getting close to the threshold, that gives them bargaining power, and that's what we see. And so that has brought Trump and his people to the negotiating table. And the Iranians have made it clear. They stated again, we are not, we're not going to even talk about our conventional capabilities. They would be crazy to do that because, as I've said, on more than one occasion, the reason that Iran has not been invaded, has not undergone a massive attack by the U.S. and Israel, is that it does have this deterrent capability. It does have this massive missile force, and so why would they give that up? That they would be insane to do that. It's just really what's keeping Iran safe. So they've said again, that's just, we're not even talking about these things. We can just talk about our civilian nuclear program. The thing is that all these things, there's a lot of detail involved, technical details on how you can really, you can monitor the compliance with the agreement and so on and so forth. And other countries need to be involved. For example, the Iranians have enriched uranium to 60% purity, which is below the bomb threshold, but it's close. Undoubtedly, if any kind of agreement that might be concluded will have to remove that 60% from Iran. But you have to work out the details, how that's done, how that's monitored, where it goes. It's most likely going to go to Russia. But all these things take time. That's what I've heard, that in general treaties, I think reading this morning, take something like 18 months to work out. And that was certainly true. I think the JCPOA took longer than that. It took years. Maybe this will go faster because you've already had the JCPOA and you've covered a lot of the ground already. But it's going to take many months, I think, at least. And let's just hope that Trump has the patience. He often seems to be impatient. He just doesn't understand that you have to work out these details.
Well, the root cause of all of this really is Gaza, is Israel and its war on the Palestinian people, its ethnic cleansing campaign. If Iran is truly, supporting the Palestinians, couldn't they make a stipulation in whatever agreements, like, yeah, we'd be happy to give up our nuclear program or to make sure that you inspect it to make sure it's civilian, whatever it is you guys need, but Israel has to stop what it's doing in Gaza. Can't they put that in there? Like, why is that not even being
Right.
debated? This is the problem that we have.
Uh-huh.
This is the root cause with the
Yeah.
Houthis, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, everything. We know what it is. It's
Yeah.
Gaza.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's possible. Maybe they've even brought it, the Iranians have brought it up and it just was shot down immediately. Maybe they just know there's no way that the Americans and certainly the Israelis will accept it. Um, that would be good. I would like to see them do that, but perhaps it's just not possible. It's just
Right. I
something
mean,
that the U.S. and Israeli side will not begin to entertain.
but I just it's silly to me that we have this this pressure on Iran this around this nuclear deal exchange, and nobody's addressing the elephant in the room, which is the ongoing genocide that the world is witnessing in Gaza. That this is a big problem with what Israel is doing, and surely that has to be part of this negotiation, right? Or you think it's not even going to be really mentioned?
Well, if it is, it hasn't appeared in any of the statements that have been made.
Do you find
That's
that
all I can
odd?
say. What's that?
Do you find that odd that it isn't? Or
Not really. I mean, it's just um, like these negotiations. Of course, the JCPOA negotiations took place well before the Gaza genocide began. Um, yeah, so the Iranians that was hard to achieve. It just may be that they understand that you throw this into the mix and that's going to blow it all up. It really could. It just might lead to maybe an immediate Israeli attack or something like that. It would just be a real. The Israelis would regard this as existential. Of course, it would probably be wise if they just stopped this onslaught in Gaza right now. But the kind of people that are in charge are not going to tolerate, I think, anything like that.
this Gaza situation so horrific, and it's just amazing that nothing is being done. That they're being pushed into starvation. It's been what 2 months now since
Yeah,
any aid has come into Gaza.
right. No, it's really the people are desperate. I was reading a description just a few days ago. So things have only gotten worse. As saying, describing a family, he said, well, the father said, I have one date in the morning and I have one date in the evening. We had some pita bread for the kids. They're like the three boys or something, and they had maybe four pieces of pita bread or three pieces of pita bread, and the youngest one just kept on crying and crying. So they gave him two, and the two older brothers agreed to split the one piece of pita bread among them. This is the kind of decisions that our families are being forced to make now, and it's happening. There's just so little comment on it. You're right. It's just beyond
Yeah,
beyond
so
horrible.
especially think about these families with little kids.
Yeah,
Like I have, obviously I have two little boys, and just the amount of care and attention they need, and if they don't have enough food, just how painful that would be for a family to see that you can't, they need nourishment. Babies need to eat constantly. It's really sad, and I think you saw the news this morning about the flotilla that was coming to Gaza, an aid
no, actually, I
flotilla.
missed that.
Okay. Well, there was an aid flotilla, and it was hit by two drones off the coast of Malta from Israel. I mean, that's over 1,000 miles away, a long ways away. A boat that's trying to bring life-saving food and medicine to the starving and dying people of Gaza was struck by the Israelis off the coast of Malta, way far away, not even close. And I'm wondering, are we going to hear a peep about this? We'll start bombing the Houthis because the Houthis are trying to stop shipping that is providing weapons and whatever to Israel. Providing economic aid to Israel, but Israel can bomb an aid flotilla, it can drone strike it, and will the world just stay silent?
Yeah,
In
I'm
international
afraid.
waters here, it just
Right. Yeah,
I
of
just,
course.
I just, how can
Right.
they keep getting away with it? They can't get away with it forever. Just the public perception of Israel. I want to see a new Gallup poll on the views that Americans have towards Israel now. It's got to be. I just don't understand how people continue to support this.
Yeah. No, it's obviously changing, trending against Israel. It's just not fast enough. Yeah, even though you do have a majority, as I said, it's just the people in power are the same old people, and they are not changing their policies one iota.
So you think that we will start to see just mass starvation? I mean, they're
well,
bombing flotillas, and they're
right. Well, yeah, no, I think clearly already starvation deaths have occurred, and they're going to incur increasing frequency. And there are going to be a lot of deaths linked to starvation too, as I said. It's just like if you're not getting enough nutrition, you already have some medical condition, you know, your chance of dying goes up considerably. So I don't know how many deaths there are. Again, it's even hard for the Gazans to keep track of it because of all the attacks on medical workers and on hospitals and clinics and so forth. I think I saw just maybe 2 days ago that all of Gaza is kind of like in danger of is starving, and if there's the highest kind of a red alert right before starvation death, and maybe there are 5 levels, and at least half of the population is at 4 and 5. They're approaching death by starvation. Now they might be able to hang on. Yeah, again, already the deaths have begun. The majority of them might be able to hang on for a couple more weeks, but at some point we're going to see mass death by starvation. And we'll see if at that point there really is some kind of reaction. It's amazing. We know what's going on. We know what's going on, but we're not doing anything about it.
It's so horrifying. Has there ever been anything like this where we had a forced starvation of a whole population like this, a civilian population, before?
Well, yeah, actually, we have had. Let's say at the end of the First World War, prior to the end of the First World War, during the First World War, the British imposed a blockade on Germany that did lead to starvation among the civilian population. And it took them a whole year after the war ended. It was just kind of bureaucratic inertia, just awful. I mean, it's something there are a lot of things I love about the British, but this was a very dark chapter in their history. And there were many, I don't know, I can't remember the numbers, but many Germans starved to death, many children. And this is even worse in that, there was, at least the Germans were able to grow some of their own food and, raise some of their own hogs. So they did have a certain amount of nutrition, but they were reliant, especially, at the end of the war, on imports and on trade, and they were deprived of that, and people did die. In Gaza, it's worse because they just don't have any means. The Israelis have not only systematically destroyed their health facilities, but they've been systematically destroying the agriculture they have. It was limited, but it was able to provide something. And they killed all the chickens, all the chickens that used to be there. And just to give you one example, guys, 99%, that's the exact figure that was given, have been killed. They had wheat fields and other agriculture fields, and the Israelis burned them. The IDF burned them. So they just don't have anything. And they've also other agricultural zones they've declared to be free fire zones, off limits to all Gazans. And so they have nothing. They're utterly dependent now on humanitarian aid, and it's been cut off. It's always been reduced. Even prior to October 7th, the Israelis played a lot of games with it and always kind of kept the supplies to just above starvation level. They would joke about it. We'll put them on a diet, ha. But now it's totally cut off 100%. And it has been for approximately 2 months. And, during the ceasefire months, the Gazans did what they could to store up food. They know the risks, but they've gone through those stores, is what I've heard. So now we have the stories about the dates and the pita bread, and that's where they are now.
Right. When you bring up the story of Germany, and I'm sure there are other examples, it doesn't seem like the intent was to starve the civilian population. It was to deprive countries economically, to deprive them of their war fighting capabilities. But what we're seeing in Gaza seems to be the intention is to starve the whole civilian population. It just seems to be very apparent that this is the goal, is to starve them.
Right. The official explanation on the part of the Israeli government is that they're putting pressure on Hamas. Yeah. So you're going to starve the civilian population to death. That's a war crime. That's just not an excuse. But I think it's really not what it's about. It's ethnic cleansing. They are driving them to desperation. They don't mind just killing them all, but they would prefer maybe if they just all got desperate and said, okay, just take us anywhere, put us on a boat, take us on a plane. And you can understand why if you were Gazan, you just might accept any solution. I think it's a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing, no question about it.
So you think we're really going to see some mass starvation just on our watch, and the
Well,
U.S.
it's hard to
is
believe
going to
that we
defend
won't.
it?
Yeah, it looks like we're right. We're within a week or a couple of weeks of it. I think that.
My God, that's so sinister. It wasn't in Iraq with the Madeleine Albright saying 500,000 Iraqi children. Is that something that we can compare to, or is this just really in a class of its own because it's such a concentrated, intentional, and we've just been seeing the destruction, the bombing.
Right.
These videos I see, it's just keep me up at night.
Yeah. Well, her comment was horrible, and but it didn't. Yeah, it was one comment. In this case, it's just that, like you say, we see it. It's just like and it really has penetrated our consciousness. A lot of people, I don't think, were ever aware of what she made, a comment that she made, and maybe didn't really believe it or whatever. But this is just incontrovertible, again, because of all the constant video evidence, the information that keeps on. That's there available for anybody who is willing to look at it. We could go on and on about the horrors that happen every day, and occasionally we dip into it because I think it's important to remind our viewers and ourselves of what's going on. But in the end, it's just like if you want to know what's happening, you can find it. It's easy enough to find. The video footage is out there, and there are many good sources of information. I find one that's been I think is particularly good is If Americans Knew. They have you can get their daily newsletter, and they just list various articles on the events that are about what's happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank. And you don't have to spend a whole lot of time. I mean, it's beyond horrifying. It happens on a daily basis. It's not like there have been a few incidents or something. It's the reality. The reality in Gaza is a nightmare.
How do you think this is all going to end?
Well, I'm afraid it might end with the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
What does that mean?
That at least that the Gazans are actually either going to die or they're going to be driven from their land. It's going to be probably a combination of the two. Maybe it won't be all of Gaza. Maybe the Israelis will just take northern Gaza and begin to settle it.
Do you think that they can do that without triggering a war?
They might be able to. That's the sad truth. You would think. But these surrounding, the governments of the surrounding countries, like, again, Egypt and Jordan, they are severely compromised. They're very corrupt. There is, again, a real anger within the population, but you can have a very angry population, but they're unarmed and they have and under the, thumb of these powerful, corrupt rulers. That kind of situation, you would think, well, it can end any day. There could be. Revolutions almost always take us by surprise. Right? That's a fact. So it could, there could be a real revolution in either or both of these countries in the near future. But it could also just go on for years and years and years. That's the sad until well after, the dirty deed is done.
Will Israel have to pay a price for everything?
Well, I think, yeah, no question they will in the long, they are paying a price. The image of Israel, as we said, has been very, very severely tarnished. And no matter what, even right now, it's been severely tarnished. And if they do cause mass starvation and they, I think they already are ethnically cleansing Gaza. It's fair to say they've already grabbed a lot of the land. I've talked about the free fire zones. They've created these buffer zones and so forth. They've already seized, close to, well over a quarter, close to like half the land in Gaza. And then when at some point they'll make it official or semi-official, and it's going to hurt Israel. I mean, it may lead to some economic sanctions. You certainly would hope so. But it's going to do, it has done and will do even more permanent damage to their reputation. And if it's maybe the current generation of leaders won't do anything about it, I think a future generation, will, because it is so horrible. Too many people know what's going on, especially younger people. And eventually when they come into power, whether it's in the United States or it's in Egypt or wherever, again, this may happen a lot faster than, it may happen sooner than we expect, but it could go on for many more years. It just seems so incredible, but let's just look at what's happening right now. Let's be honest about it.
I just can't believe that we will watch a whole population potentially starve to death, or a large percentage starve to death. And then we'll support it, and we'll try to justify it. It's like, what is this? This is genocide.
Right.
I just people don't want to use that term, but
we
I
saw
don't know
it
what.
Right, and
you have to use that term. You have to, because that's what it is, right? I mean, this is what we're looking at.
Right. Yeah. No, I know. What can I say? But that's what's happening. It's just, like I say, how can this be? But it is happening.
I just don't understand how nobody can do anything. I mean, I understand how compromised the United States is.
Well, you have a lot of true believers in Israel who are very passionate about it, and they will not hear about this genocide. They refuse to really believe it. And then, unfortunately, I think some of them do believe it and just support it. They are ethnic supremacists. I mean, and they have a lot of power in all these countries, in the West.
There's this talk about civil war brewing in Israel. Do you think that's actually true? That maybe that's a way that this could end? Is that that Israeli society itself just falls apart, fractures too much?
It certainly could. There are very, very high tensions, a lot of anger, directed against Netanyahu and his government. But then he has very powerful supporters. He's gained, through Ben-Gvir has gained control over the police, has gained increasing control, not total control, over the IDF. Part of the IDF, an important part of it, remains in the liberal camp. Now, if civil war breaks out, it won't be over a disagreement on Gaza policy, except for the hostages. That's where there is a big point of disagreement. There's one group that says, we got to make a ceasefire now because that's the only way to get the remaining hostages out. And that's a considerable, I think some polls show that it's a majority of Israelis that believe that. And many of them are very, very passionate about that. But they don't care about the Palestinians. Like, once we get the hostages out, we can go back to, ethnic cleansing. I don't think it's clear that they don't care, unfortunately. It's very sad, but true. It's just clear that, the people that truly care about the starvation, the suffering of the Palestinians, they're just a fringe element within Israel. My hat's off to them. They're brave individuals. They're good people, but they're a fringe element there. They just don't have any political impact. So if they're, I don't think there will be a civil war, but there is very severe, there is a real polarization, a lot of passions, at least, a lot of anger about Netanyahu's policy, not just vis-a-vis the hostages, but also concerning, the Supreme Court and Shin Bet and, his efforts to really kind of take control of these various um, government institutions. And, there are people that are really resisting them, see them as a threat to their whole way of life. So it could break out. There are a lot of IDF members, like retired ones, that have signed, open public letters condemning Netanyahu's policy. So there clearly is quite a bit of resistance within the IDF to what he's doing. So you do have guns on both sides. But if it happens, again, whoever comes out on top, I'm afraid to say it probably won't really make a change vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But, who knows?
I just feel
again, nobody knows what would happen if civil war actually broke out there. I think it's unlikely, partly because Netanyahu, he's pretty good at, he's a very wily politician, as we've seen. And there's many times when people have thought that his career was about to end. I think he'll probably come out on top, and he'll always play the Iranian threat card or whatever. It's just like we Israelis have to stand together, and that he may, be able to play that card again and prevent, maintain control, over the military and over Israeli society.
It's so disheartening when I talk to you about this, because it's just the way that you speak about it. It seems like there's just not really much hope for the people of Gaza.
Yeah.
And I just don't want to give up hope.
Yeah. Well, don't give up hope. I know. I am very pessimistic. It's just that but just to say, there can be surprises on both sides. We had, the collapse of the Syrian government, I think, was a very nasty, very unpleasant, and really a very disheartening surprise. But it was a surprise. It was not something that I hadn't foreseen, or any, I think, except for people who were working in secret on the ground. Nobody else foresaw that this was going to happen, right? But there's always the potential for some surprise on the other side. I don't know, a revolution in Egypt, or I don't see any signs of it, but some sort of new movement within Israel. Perhaps if there really is chaos starts to take place in Israel, there might be a real fundamental, you could hope at least, looks like all the trends are going the other way, but you could hope that there could be a real reassessment on a significant part of the Israeli population of what they're doing, what Zionism is all about. But, I have to see some sort of indications of it. We can always hope against hope, and sometimes, we're surprised in a pleasant way. That's all I can say.
Yeah, well, as maybe there's more and more global support for the Houthis, the people of Yemen, the Iranians as well, because these seem to be the forces that are willing to stand up to Israel. I mean, really, it's just the Houthis. Iran, as a potential financial backer, and we know its role as the axis of resistance, but it's not actively engaged in stopping this genocide. The Houthis are the only ones. I've mentioned this before, that sometimes I wish that the Iran negotiations fail, just because I want Iran. I almost want an attack on Iran so Iran can finally end this. And I know you say that's not something I wish for, but is this a bad feeling that I have, that I want to see Israel punished, but I don't want everybody in Israel to die, obviously. But they can't get away with a genocide. Yeah. They need to be punished some way. There needs to be a recognition of what's happening, and I'm wanting that, but do I need to tamp down that feeling that I have?
I think clear that Zionism is such an ugly phenomenon, and it is such an ugly expression of ethno-supremacism, that I think it's not unreasonable or in any way unethical to wish for some kind of humiliation for the Israelis to be taken down a few pegs. They need to be. I agree. I guess you just have to look at. You have to be realistic. It's just like a war between Israel and Iran. It just would be very dangerous. Again, it could cause real suffering in Iran too, and then there's always the risk, like if Iran is really winning that war, that the Israelis are going to resort to nuclear weapons. I think that's a very, very real risk, and it's just. So there's a potential. You're talking about maybe millions dead or something. So it's hard. I can understand. I guess I often have the same feeling, but then I think twice about it and saying maybe we really I understand why the Iranians are doing whatever they can to avoid this. It seems like the safest route. Even this is very dangerous. But it's just that if we can get a real change within the U.S., because the U.S. can really change Israel, and largely in a peaceful way, or at least potentially could, because Israel cannot do anything that it's doing now without this rock solid support from the U.S. And if that just really changed in a very significant way, if we finally got a president who said, enough, okay, it's over, guys, you're not getting another bullet from us, they would have to change. There would be. There's always the risk of some kind of nuclear blackmail, but it seems like that could bring about a real change. It could lead to the end of Zionism in at least a relatively peaceful way. That's the thing I hope for. But again, I think that eventually we can get there. But it's just there are those encouraging polls and so forth. But it's just it hasn't penetrated into the establishment at all. Even like I pointed out, the so-called far left members of the Democratic Party aren't really challenging Zionism. AOC and Bernie Sanders, they have done, they have made some open criticisms and have voted for some restrictions, but it's not even close to being far enough to really ending the support for Zionism.
They can't come soon enough. Just everything about Israel is been so ugly. It's really been laid to bear. And I think so many people are aware of it now. Prior to October 7th, I think most people just, they didn't really think about it. They didn't know. It's like, it's a complicated situation over there. It's not becoming complicated for most people now, most of the world. And I think even within this country, the longer this goes on, I'd like to see the support. It's just becoming so apparent that this country is an Israel first country. It's not an America first country. And the disgust I have for the Zionist movement, the Israeli government, its control over my government, what it's doing to the people of Gaza, what it's done to the Middle East, just the more you learn about the history and everything, and what it's done to this country, what it's done to evangelical Christians here in the United States. It's just so disgusting, so gross. If there's any type of cause you want to take up, this is the cause. I feel like this is something that I feel personally like this needs to change. This needs to end. We can't have this type of relationship. We can't have a country that's actively committing genocide that we're supporting, that buys off all of our politicians, that has this huge lobbying influence, that has got the United States involved in all these wars in the Middle East, costs us trillions of dollars, millions of people dead. And for what? For what? To say that these are the chosen people and they have the right to do whatever they want in this land, take people's homes, kill them. It's just insane. The whole thing is so sick. I just want it to end. And I know it's ending, but it's so slow and painful, the process of this ending. I know it's happening. I know it's this whole loss of support. This is the process, but it's such a painful process that might mean the death of all of the Gaza people in Gaza, or a huge percentage of them, and the deaths of all these people in Lebanon and in Syria and in the West Bank. And the Houthis, as well. These assassinations against the Iranians. Just everything is just so evil is what it is.
Right. And I think it needs to be emphasized that, our culpability, the U.S. culpability in many ways equals that of Israel. In a way, it's easier to explain Israeli behavior in some ways than American behavior, because you say, okay, they are a small country, they're afraid, they have, and they've also been, they have been raised with these ideas, they've gone through school, whatever, it's clear that it's hard not to be a Zionist if you're in Israel. It should not be hard to oppose Zionism in the U.S. It's, in a way, it seems like it's something that people just chose, like an identity that they chose for themselves without any pressures whatsoever. And so in a way, the culpability is even greater. What are you doing? Why have you have all the causes in the world. Why have you chosen this one and made it your central cause? But we have, again, we're just entirely complicit in this. So much of our, again, of our government, but many of our people too.
Well, let's pray for an end. I guess that's all we can do.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, do what we and many, many, many other people are doing is just to bring this to other people's attention. It is having an effect on opinion, and that in the end, that could, I think, will prove decisive. Maybe it'll be sooner. Perhaps I'm overly pessimistic. I hope to be proven wrong in that way.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. Well, don't give up hope on Gaza. Anybody listening, just talking about it, posting about it, sharing it, liking things on X and Twitter. Every little bit helps. It's slowly changing the narrative, and it's painful to watch, but we are winning this war against Zionism. It is happening at a huge cost, but because of the actions that Israel is inflicting upon these people. But Zionism will end, and I hope we'll be around to see it. I think it will be sooner than we think. Okay, Dan, I guess we can end it there.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.
You too.